are you doing?
Good morning, Murat. I'm doing well. How are you doing?
Good. It's so nice to connect. We've seemed to connect a lot through video and Instagram, even though we're in the same city. And I do see you around many galleries when I go, and I always kind of tell myself that if I don't see you at the gallery, then there's something wrong because you're
Right.
always there.
I must
Um,
be missing. Yeah.
So, for those of you that don't know you yet, but I'm sure a lot of our listeners will know you, I just want to introduce you as Andrew Booth. You have been not sort of hiding, but you have been handling a really cool account on Instagram called Vancouver Art Blog. And when I first found it online, I was trying to find who was this person behind this really cool account. And then I just asked around, and they're like, "Oh, that's Andrew." And I think now your account became it kind of shifted from being anonymous to having its own identity as the Vancouver Art Blog. And I hear that now you're thinking about having an actual blog for it. Is that what's
Ye-
happening?
Well, I'm at some point I'm moving things to create a website version of this blog, and I use the term blog loosely. I realize that there isn't a large text component to it, but first of all, the Instagram account handle was available, and the other ones didn't really make sense in terms of like what type of content that I was producing. But no, I am in the process of creating a Vancouver Art Blog website, which I think does a couple things. Number one, it archives things on the web, making it a little bit more easy for people to search for this content online, as Instagram isn't really great for that. And then also, there are some people that just aren't on Instagram, and I'm hoping to reach those people or show this content to those people that just want to find it on Google or on a website.
Definitely. Well, first of all, thank you for doing that, because what you're doing for also the people that are not aware is that you are really documenting the really really rich scene that's happening in Vancouver in terms of visual arts. Um, I can always count on going to your account and like knowing what exhibitions are happening. You also visit studios of artists that you know or you enjoy their work or you're curious about.
Mm-hmm.
So that's definitely something we can count on, and I can only imagine how much work that is, being at these exhibition spaces every weekend, right?
Yeah, and there's probably a bit of a backstory to that too. And I also think I want to comment quickly on the anonymous thing. Like my intention when I started the account, and I think this context kind of helps with where we're going here, is that I don't think I really wanted it to be anonymous. Like I think that the primary intention at the beginning was to make it about the artists and the artwork and the galleries, right? And so I know that there is sort of, the algorithmic gods would prefer a person to be on the image or in the content and to be like have a bit of personality behind it. But I felt like the purpose for me was to share the artwork itself and to celebrate the artist's work. So I didn't want it to be about me. And I was also inspired by this other Instagram account that exists called Vancouver Coffee Snob. And that account is this person that goes around, and in their case, they review coffee shops. But what they do is they basically promote and showcase all of these, like from the, hotel lobby coffee shops to chain coffee shops, and everything in between. They go around and basically like discover for me all of these great coffee shops. And I love coffee culture. So I was inspired by this person who wanted to remain anonymous and be about the coffee and be about the coffee shops. So that's essentially what I was trying to do with my version of that. And yeah, so my in long before the pandemic, my routine on Saturday was to go around and visit a variety of different art galleries around Vancouver. And that was a way of like resetting after what was typically a busy week at work, or like just basically escaping my weekly routine and going in and seeing interesting art, or going and seeing just, cool things, to put it very simply. So at some point in time, I'd been looking for a singular resource uh, on Instagram that provided me with like what's going on in Vancouver's contemporary art scene. And there I want to acknowledge there is a there is a curated list called Instant Coffee, no relation to Vancouver Coffee Snob, but Instant Coffee had been doing this for a long time and doing great things, but it was text based and it was sent out in an email that frankly just went to my junk most of the time. And I couldn't find anything on Instagram, which of course is like primarily a visual platform. And so I've been going to art galleries on Saturdays anyways, and taking photos just because I was keeping them for my own purposes. And at some point in time, I just thought, if I put these photos onto Instagram, um, maybe there's something here. Like I couldn't find this resource for myself, so I thought, well, I may as well just build it and see what happens. And here we are, a couple of years later, and I think we're sort of in this inflection point now where it seems to be really picking up some steam. And there's my cat twerking over in the background there. I don't know what's going on with Archie, but anyways, so yeah, it's we're rounding this bend now. I see that the world is sort of opening back up again, and people are curious about what's going on out there, and certainly, like, I get a lot of great feedback and response to the Instagram account that people find it to be helpful.
And absolutely, and I think you have done that 100%. You have made it about the work, about the artists, and I love seeing how you're constantly growing and evolving that account. And I think that that can only also reflect how in your personal life you have been also developing and growing your art collection, and that's something that I was hoping we could speak about today. Again,
Mhm.
I do think that your collection on its own could be like its own series of blog posts or even podcasts, because the story behind each piece that you've acquired, it's probably definitely worth speaking about, and also the work in itself. But I was wondering if today we could have like a general overview, I guess, especially of when you started collecting and why. Can
Yeah,
you share that with us?
yeah, absolutely. And a couple things just to sort of lay the groundwork here. Number one is that you know the pandemic has largely been a terrible thing for many people across the board, including a lot of my really close friends. And in my circumstance, I have the great fortune of working for a company that was able to pivot to working from home without any interruption, and I was able to maintain employment without any challenges there. So I was set up to be living quite comfortably within my own space, working from home. And when I started working from home, this is again about just over 2 years ago now. I realized that I'm going to be spending a lot more time in my own space. And at the time, I'm surrounded by like a small amount of work that had been collected over a couple of years that was mostly prints or sketches or works that I had done in my own time, and it wasn't it wasn't interesting, for lack of a better term. And at the beginning of the pandemic, I started to think about filling my space, filling my surroundings with more interesting art. And that planted the seed in terms of like thinking about a collection. And I've done a lot of reading and research and spoken to a lot of people about this idea of collecting, and it can mean different things for a lot of different people, especially the means in which you can collect, right? And there's a comment on that too about how you can actually make it feasible living on modest means, which I do. But then as I started to look at art, I wanted to take a sort of 5 to 10 year outlook, meaning when I look back upon this collection, I want it to be like I want there to be a narrative here. I want there to be the collection to be greater than the sum of its parts, right? Rather than just like individually collecting art that I find interesting at that particular moment. And again, it's all highly personal, and that might be what you're trying to achieve. But when I thought about what type of art really resonates with me, there's a couple streams. Number one is like lens based art, but not necessarily a pure photograph all the time. I think just growing up in Vancouver, which is, the sort of home of conceptual photography, some might argue, and having a bit of a photo practice earlier on in my life, I gravitate towards artists that work with cameras, but also like on the periphery of photography. And we'll talk about some of those particular artists. And I also have an interest in sculpture. I think sculpture is a really beautiful way of living with art. And I think that in a typical Vancouver dwelling, we don't have a lot of square footage. So how do you live with work that isn't hung on a wall? I think that's a really fascinating concept in terms of like acquiring art that you live with, not just put away in storage or, you know, I don't know what else you do with it. But so my collection, the beginning of, I would say that the beginning of my collection started with a Gigame Cookwitz painting from Macaulay Fine Art. And this was before I was, this is before I realized a couple things in terms of like actually acquiring art, beyond just like an editioned print or something, you know, a sketch, for example. At that time, I approached Sarah and Nikki at Macaulay and inquired about this particular work by Gigame, which is this beautiful painting that I can show, overlaying here afterwards. And you know, I couldn't afford to fork out however much it was at that particular time. And I said, "Would you be willing to do a payment plan? Like, could I spread out this payment over a couple months?" And without even blinking, they said, "Sure." Like, I think they were keen to make a sale, like, you know, as every art gallerist probably is, and I could only afford to give them a certain amount of money each month, you know, to continue to eat and pay my mortgage and things like that. And so they did. And this light bulb went off. And of course, for many others that are listening or watching can relate, is like that opens up your eyes in terms of like the type of art that you can collect now. Like if you can foster a relationship with a gallerist to the point that you can have those conversations about structuring a payment plan over 3, 6, 8 months down the road, then suddenly, you know, that $10,000 piece of art, which was frankly not attainable at that time, becomes a $500 a month payment over a period of time, as an example. So it started with Gigame, and then it went to, let me think here, Isabel Wynn, that sculpture piece that I bought, which I love, and Ian Wallace, Lyle Reimer, and so on. And recently there was these Michelle Bowie photographs behind me. Sarah Goulamali from Burrard Arts Foundation. I acquired one of her works there. It's thrilling, but it's also a very slippery slope, right? Like you can have multiple payment plans going on at once and not really realize the economics of it all. But you know, I don't worry about that because my lifestyle is as such where I'm not traveling. Well, minus the New York trip, but I'm not doing a lot of traveling. I'm not driving to work. My expenses are just like lesser each month, and that money I can move towards acquiring art. And again, fitting. And I think the other important, you know, philosophy to this is like thinking about working within a structure, working within those streams of, you know, primarily lens-based art and sculpture. Because then when I look back, even after this last 2 years, I can see a more concise body of work, which is this thread that goes between each artist, regardless of where they come from or where they're practicing.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Andrew. And I think that you definitely hit the spot. Speaking about like financing or buying artwork, it does seem to
Mhm.
be one of the one of the main deterrents for people or to not acquire art. They sometimes they don't know that they can actually afford it. We do
Mhm.
tend to think that art is very expensive. Of course, it's very valuable and it's definitely
Right.
worth its price. So thank you for I guess demystifying that, because that's something really important to put out there, that there's definitely ways in which you can live with art, whether that be, you know, acquiring maybe perhaps prints to start off
Mhm.
with, or original works under monthly payments, perhaps renting at times. That could be a
Yep.
good option. So thank you for sharing that. And another thing that I definitely want to highlight once again is the fact that, you know, because you, well, I believe you might be an artist at base as well. There's a part of you that has that sensibility. We can talk about that in a second. But so you have that sort of angle, and then, you know, the fact that you actually constantly go and meet artists and see works, meet gallerists. I definitely do think that that is another big point to emphasize if you know, whoever's listening or watching is curious about collecting art. Definitely finding what it is that calls you or speaks to you is
Mhm.
the one of the biggest factors to develop, right? And you've done that. So I find that really, really admirable and really cool how you are in a sense continuously curating your art, your collection. It's very very conscious, and I relate a lot to your art collection because I happened to move back to Vancouver around the same time you started collecting. So many of the pieces that you now own, I saw in galleries, and I have this feeling like, oh, that is so cool because Andrew has, in a sense, yeah, he's really collected pieces that are significant to the story and the history of Vancouver art scene. So that's really great. So thank you for
And there's
sharing.
just a couple, like to pick up on that last point, like I'm acquiring art partly intentionally, but also just happens to be a byproduct of like art of my time. So of these last few years, I'm buying art that's produced in sometimes in this particular era that we're living in. And like you said, it's nice to know that when a work is acquired, that it's not just getting stored in a crate in some collection that is never seen again. Like what I'm also trying to do through my blog, I suppose, but also just in some other way, is like giving the art more time in the spotlight. You know what I mean? Like once it's seen in a gallery space, it can just go into storage sometimes and never be seen again, or into an institution and be shown once every 8 years. Yeah, the sticker shock with acquiring art can feel very intimidating, and I do want to acknowledge again that we live in a very expensive city with a crazy high cost of living. The value of something that you acquire, it pays itself off pretty quickly the more time you spend with it, especially if you buy something that maybe challenges you, or you have an approach to the type of art that you acquire, and it may be work that isn't always necessarily something that is just visually or aesthetically beautiful. There might be a deeper story to it, which continues to pique your interest the more that you engage with it. And I like to think about a lot of the artwork that I'm acquiring here when I do my research, which, this is my form of art education, is going to these galleries and meeting the artists and gallerists. This is my formal, for lack of a better term, training. This research goes into the type of art that I acquire, and learning more about the pieces then builds this story and this narrative to each of these works that, is beyond a conversational piece, right? Like there is now something that you can engage with mentally with this work, as opposed to just being stimulated by it visually. So there's a lot there, and I'm glad that you are, again, that you and I have crossed paths at this particular time, and that we seem to have a similar sort of eye towards the type of art that we gravitate towards, which is great.
Absolutely, yes. So I'm going to change a bit of topic here, sort of.
Hmm.
But you recently took a trip, and of course, I'm sure there's so many stories to tell from it. But why don't we start in the why? Of course, do we need a why to go to New York if you're an art lover? But you finally said, okay, this weekend I'm going to spend them in New York, and I'm going to discover some galleries in New York. So I'm
Hmm.
wondering, did you feel like there wasn't enough to see in Vancouver, or you just simply it was a trip you wanted to take for a while?
I think after 2 years, or frankly longer than that, of not having been on a plane and not having traveled abroad, like I just thought, now's a good time. Now it feels like it's safe enough to travel. I might go down to New York. And there was actually a very particular reason, or a couple reasons, why I wanted to go to New York at this time. It was the opening of the Whitney Biennial, but it was also the closing of a couple of shows. So the Kevin Beasley show at Hill Art, the Austin Lee show at Jeffrey Deitch, Jennifer Packer at Whitney. Like there was a number of shows that within this like basically week long window were either opening or closing at that time. So I planned it, and it also just so happened to be like the week in between the different spring breaks in the States too. So it was great timing on many fronts. But I've been to New York a couple times before, and always am blown away by the quality of, or the scale of the gallery community down there, or like the scale of art galleries down there. Of course, it's nothing like Vancouver, but I don't expect it to be. And I think when I think about this trip that I just came back from, first of all, there was that shooting on the last day, so it's just like a crazy last day, right? the shooting on the subway, as you might have heard. Anyways, neither here nor there. Okay, I definitely knew about it. Anyways, um, there's this. I found a couple of observations from New York, at least just from an outsider's perspective. I saw a lot of paintings, and I think I could count on one hand, and the number is two. The number of photography exhibitions that I saw. There's a number of sculptural exhibitions which I saw that were kind of interesting, but the vast majority were painting shows, and I think that might be because of two things. One, again, going back to the square footage of a typical New York dwelling is quite small, so they're probably thinking about paintings hang easier than living with sculpture or other work like that. I think just the economics of also selling paintings, there's those galleries are probably trying to recoup some revenue over the last 2 years of the pandemic, and selling paintings might just be an easier method there. But it just so happened that the vast majority of works that I saw were paintings. And yeah, standout shows for me, like the Kevin Beasley show at Hill Art lived up to expectations. I love his sculptural work. Jennifer Packer was fantastic at Whitney. The Whitney Biennial was great too. And then Michael Heiser at Gagosian, which is a big rock and iron sculptures, which I posted about on my Instagram account, was like larger than life. It was a spectacular thing to see in person. But when I came back from New York, or rather when I think about this trip, honestly, it was probably a bit overwhelming for me because, I'd been in more or less isolation and working from home for the last 2 years. And then to be thrust into the middle of Manhattan, one of the busiest cities in North America, it was a lot. So I don't think I was mentally prepared for that much commotion and chaos. And compounded by the fact that there was the shooting on the final day, like I was just ready to come home. And when I came back home and the first Saturday after the trip, going in my typical art gallery hop, it just felt like, okay, this is more my speed. And it was nice to see some photographs. It was nice to see some fellow gallery hoppers at openings, other collectors, artists. So it was a nice trip, but I'm really glad to be back home.
Well, welcome back. We're glad that you're back. Of course, your trip didn't stop you from posting art. So
Mhm.
I have a hard time keeping up with your posts. There's always new ones, and I love it because every time I go back, it's like, oh, I didn't see this one, and then I have to like see what's happening. So yeah, thank you for doing that because I'm sure all of your followers also feel the same way. They feel kind of up to date as to what is happening in Vancouver. So that's just always great to kind of count on you. I hope it's not
Mhm.
like too much, but I know you enjoy it. So that's
I
just
do. And the one thing I've since discovered with this account, and I didn't realize this early on, is that, I can make a unique post every single day for the entire year where I'm covering different galleries, different artists, different shows, and I'm never duplicating posts. Like there's a lot happening in Vancouver, which I don't necessarily think I really realized early on. When you, and this is part of the reason why I started the account, is that like if you were to Google, art in Vancouver or Vancouver art, you're gonna get the Vancouver Art Gallery, you'll get the Keg, you'll get the Mural Fest, but then like buried in those search results is any of those other galleries, Monty Clark, Catriona, Fizaka's, Willabale. Like I realized very quickly that someone who didn't come through the art institutions or art schooling in Vancouver may not be aware of those galleries below the Keg and the Vancouver Art Gallery. And there's so many spaces, as you know, to discover beyond those. And so I'm basically trying to build a bit of a bridge to the people that were like me that didn't go to art school, but have maybe um, a potential interest in learning about contemporary art in Vancouver, but don't want to be intimidated by walking into those white walled galleries thinking like they're going to try and sell you art, or there's sticker shock, or you just feel like you don't belong. I think art galleries are for everybody because we all appreciate art on some level. It's just, I think it can feel intimidating if you don't speak the language of contemporary art. But I also think that's totally fine. Like if you don't understand, if you come out of a gallery having no idea what you just saw, I think that's actually a really thrilling experience. And that's sometimes what the artist is trying to do. And I'd say that's successful.
I agree with you. There's definitely so many places to discover in Vancouver. And I really do love that about being back. Is in
Hmm.
contrast to living in a city, I guess, similar to New York, having lived in Paris for 5 years. I was a bit scared for my own mental sake that I wouldn't have enough exhibitions to see or artistic activity, but I can't keep up, and I love it because I think that's also great, like not being able to do everything and always have more to see and learn. I would have to disagree with the not understanding everything because, as you know, I am a great advocate for art mediation and I love
Yes.
explaining art. But I do agree that at times we're not meant to like or understand everything. And so, yes, that's definitely I guess, a provocative angle that that we can get from art. But anyways, Andrew, I guess one last thing because again, we could go in depth into your pieces, but maybe that's something we can do at a later time. But now that you've had, in a sense, you can look back into the heavy lockdown periods of the pandemic, and as you say, as you mentioned as well, this kind of like going back outside and being surrounded by people. That's also been a bit hard for me as well. So you kind
Hmm.
of have that um, gaze to the past of the time, but also in terms of having been to New York. And I'm wondering, with all of that, you've just mentioned that the speed in Vancouver, you find it to be a little bit perhaps slower than New York. And I'm also wondering if you are excited about something in particular about Vancouver. Do
Hmm.
you, in a sense, are you content with what is happening in Vancouver in terms of art activity, or is there something that you wish um, could develop further? Um,
Yeah, I mean that's such a there's a great deal of complexity to that issue that I'm just frankly not that well versed on. Like I think my perspective of all this is just someone an art admirer who is documenting what they see. I try to be I'm trying to sort of piece together what the Vancouver art scene is in some ways. I don't have answers to that, but like you said, coming back from New York and just seeing, I mean, even 2 square blocks of the Chelsea Art District is probably bigger than all of Vancouver's art scene. But I don't think it makes sense to compare Vancouver to New York or LA. However, if I think about other major cities in North America, Dallas, Phoenix, wherever, I don't have intimate knowledge of those spaces, but I've got to think that Vancouver is as good, if not better, or as big, if not larger, than those spaces. And I also just think there's, this journey that I'm on is also filling a lot of gaps within my knowledge of the history of Vancouver's art scene. And the more I discover about, certainly conceptual photography that came out of Vancouver and all the other artists that worked in the last 5 or 6 decades, even just discovering Nova Gallery, which is this, Andrew and Claudia started in this late 70s and early 80s. Like these are really important moments in Vancouver's art scene that are known by certain people within certain circles, but it's I didn't know about that until now, and I've been living in Vancouver my entire life. So I don't know what Vancouver's art scene is. When we perhaps step outside of the city, I think you'd be surprised to hear from people who live abroad or live in other parts of North America how they see Vancouver's art scene. And I think we are more celebrated outside of Vancouver than we may appreciate and acknowledge here. I mean, there's a lot to that. Vancouver is very much like a participatory city. We like to go out and hike mountains and ski and do all those sorts of things. So it's just a different city.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. And there's also there's like a constant flux here in Vancouver. There's galleries that close and some that open. We
Mhm.
do have great institutions that are, I guess, magnets for new talents, and I'm always really excited for that. I know that you are as well, attending like graduating MFA shows. That's always great to see and witness.
Mhm.
Um, well, Andrew, thank you so much. If you have perhaps a few last words for those listeners or viewers out there that are, curious about collecting, you've shared
Mhm.
really valuable thoughts and insights. But perhaps there's something that is hard to pinpoint, that sort of desire or um, instinct to collect that you might relate to when you see a piece and you have this coup de coeur, as we say in French. You just need to have it, right? Of course, after you think about, okay, how am I going to afford this? What's my plan? How
Right.
does it fit into my collection? But I just, from the general outsider view that I have of your collection, I'm sure that you have those moments of, this piece needs to come into my living space.
Yeah. And that moment is also it's this really thin crossover line of both feeling that in that moment, but also having done enough research on that artist or that artwork to have that sense of appreciation. Because oftentimes when you see something, especially, you know, that is maybe a bit more conceptual or isn't apparently obvious, like the story behind it, you have to do some research. But then as time goes on, that piece potentially becomes unavailable, right? So you do have to act kind of simultaneously, both you have to be quite efficient with a lot of this, is doing your research, but then also acting or not acting on acquiring that piece. So there is a bit of that is a challenge, because of course you don't want to let too much time pass if this is something you're serious about. But then again, you should probably spend time researching that, understanding if that makes sense in your collection, if that is compelling enough for you. But also, I encourage people when they think about collecting to not just acquire art that they find visually beautiful. Um, think about acquiring art that maybe challenges you, because and and I think of the same way when I think about the type of music that I listen to. And for those that are maybe fans of like a band like Radiohead, for example, when I first discovered Radiohead, I thought, like, what is this trash? And I'm talking like the late 90s. I'm like, I don't know why people have any, I don't know why these guys are popular. This music is just like, it makes no sense to me. But as time went on and as I grew an appreciation for them and saw their overall body of work develop into what it's become, I mean, they're one of my favorite bands now, and I could listen to them all day long. So it's something that maybe challenges me at first and continues to challenge me now, but in a way that's more stimulating, rather than just being like a flash in the pan flavor of the week kind of thing, where you love it instantly, but you grow tired of it very quickly. So in the same way of visual art or contemporary art, maybe don't dismiss work that is challenging at first. Ask yourself, why is this challenging? Like, what is it about what is this about this work that makes me feel a certain way? And think about maybe a couple years down the road how that continues to sit in your mind, and like can be a really stimulating, really energizing piece to live with and to have that relationship with it. I might have mentioned this earlier, but like when you acquire a work, for example, Janine Freyna Jutli's tarp sculpture that I've acquired, and you live with this piece domestically, when an artist creates a work, I feel like they're sending out a transmission, they're sending out a signal, and I am now in dialogue with this work that I live with. So it's really like thrilling and powerful to have this piece with me, where I'm on the receiving end of this dialogue with this artist. And I see it now, adjacent to other works that kind of fit this larger narrative. So I don't know, there's more to think about than just buying a pretty painting or a nice photograph, right? Like, what is the artist saying, and how can you piece them together with other artists that are saying similar or different things, and how does that collection become greater than the sum of its parts?
I love that. That's like a perfect closure to this. I think if I were an artist, you would be like my dream collector, someone that really appreciates and values and knows how to live in constant dialogue with the pieces. I'm sure
I
there's.
have to give a quick shout out. Sorry, I have to give a quick shout out to Anne and Marshall Webb. I met them a number of weeks ago at Katrina Jeffries. I was introduced to them, and they're wonderful collectors, and their collection is something to marvel at, and they've been collecting for 40 years now. I was able to come up to their space in downtown Vancouver, and the way they live with their art, a lot of it is highly conceptual art, is so inspiring. Just to see how they curate their space. It's such a dynamic space, but the way they live with their art and how each piece has a story, and how you can see the through line with all of these pieces over the many decades they've been collecting, that is what energizes me to keep this going, and to think about how I can be that person down the line, or even, now.
That's beautiful. Those are great role models to to kind of base jump off from. Andrew,
Absolutely.
thank you so much again for this. Such a lovely conversation. I'm glad that we were able to continue this talk and finally make it available for our audiences. And I didn't leave it lost in our transcript from last year. So thank you so much for that.
So nice to
And
talk to you.
likewise, thank you.